Thank you all for joining us tonight for this conversation on violence. As you know, we will hear from experts about what other cities are doing to effectively reduce violence in communities across the country. This is an incredibly important issue for St. Louis. Our city regularly tops national lists for gun violence and homicides. St. Louis is often referred to as the murder capital of the United States. This is a reputation that is not only strangling our growth regionally, but it's a reality that is devastating families. Every murder causes immeasurable suffering, and the impact of collective gun costs that gun violence has on our regional economy creates a cycle of stagnation, a cycle that we have to break. St. Louis as a community cannot expect to be a region that can once again be growing and thriving until we can work together to address violence within the shared community that we all call St. Louis. I want to be clear on the front end of this program that this is not a political event. The experts on this panel are in no way offering political support by participating, nor are the hundreds of folks who have registered and are watching tonight indicating support by listening and asking questions. But make no mistake, adequately addressing violence in our community will require political support and commitment from political leaders at every level. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Richard Rosenfeld, the Curator's Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. His research focuses on crime trends and the impact of policing on crime. He is a fellow and past president of the American Society of Criminology. While Dr. Rosenfeld is based here in St. Louis, he is known internationally for his work. I first had the luxury of meeting Rick at the Board of Aldermen as a member of the Public Safety Committee. In my first years at the board, Rick regularly attended hearings updating the Board of Aldermen on crime statistics and analytics. We are incredibly lucky to have you here tonight, and we are incredibly lucky to have you here in the city of St. Louis. And with that, I'll turn the program over to you, Dr. Rosenfeld.
Thank you, Cara. I appreciate the invitation to participate tonight. I'm a born and raised St. Louisan. So this issue has not only professional, but personal interest for me. We have a distinguished group of individuals who are going to be speaking tonight. I will introduce each of them before they give their 5 to 7 minute brief presentation. And then we will open it up for questions and answers. We've got a lot of questions that have come in, so I expect this to be a productive and lively discussion. Before I introduce our first speaker, I want to just provide a minute's worth of background to build on what Cara mentioned when she talked about St. Louis having a really serious violent crime problem. That probably comes as little news to anyone who's listening. But as an example, our violent crime problem has always been distressingly high, and in recent months, it's grown even worse. We're now running somewhere upwards of 150 homicides since the beginning of 2020. That compares with 110 last year. And last year's rate was altogether too high. During just the last month, homicides in the city of St. Louis have more than doubled. As of last week, the month before last week, homicides were running. We had 42 homicides in the city. That was up from 20 during the same time last year. Carjackings over the same period, just a month ago, are up 58% compared to the same period last year. Gun assaults are up 15%. So we're looking at a serious problem that has grown even more serious just over the past few months. So with that as our rather distressing background, let me introduce our first speaker. His name is McLively. Mike is a senior staff attorney at the Giffords Law Center and directs the organization's Community Violence Initiative, which is an effort to use policy mechanisms to support and promote evidence-based violence intervention strategies in America's most impacted communities. He's the author of several major reports on the topic of community violence. He's spoken in many public forums and to state and local leaders across the country about the need to address the day-to-day shootings that fuel America's gun violence epidemic. So Mike, you have your 5 to 7 minutes.
Thanks so much, Rick. Thank you for the opportunity, Cara, and everyone to be here to speak with all of you about this pressing issue. As Rick said, my name is Mike McLively, and I'm with Giffords Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence. I'm based in Oakland, California. And I think my message here tonight, just overall for my first few minutes, is just one of hope. In the city where I live in Oakland, we've seen a 50% reduction in homicides and shootings over the last few years. And at Giffords, we've studied very deeply what's been going on in Oakland and have some very concrete takeaways that I want to share with all of you, and strategies that Oakland has been putting in place over the last few years to help reduce violence. I won't spend much time talking about the problem in St. Louis. I think everyone is already very familiar with it. We don't need to waste our time talking about that. We should be talking about the solutions. I do think it's worth pointing out that a very large percentage, Rick was just telling me, more than 90% of homicides in the city of St. Louis are committed with a firearm. So when we're talking about gun violence and homicide in St. Louis, as in many other cities across the country, homicides are driven by gun violence, and it's important to understand that relationship. So again, I direct our Community Violence Initiative, and just to give you a brief introduction, Giffords itself is named after former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, who of course was shot at an event she was hosting back in 2011 in Arizona. And the organization that she founded and that I work for is dedicated to finding solutions to gun violence, to ending this epidemic that disproportionately impacts America. And what we're doing with the Community Violence Initiative is looking at community-centric strategies that have helped to reduce violence significantly, that have been developed in recent years and implemented in many of our cities. And we've looked for now several years across the entire country to see where are we having the most success on this issue of just, in the news, we read the most about mass shootings and events where many people are shot at the same time. But the reality is it's day-to-day shootings that are happening in our city streets, like you're seeing there in St. Louis, that are driving the bulk of shootings. And so a lot of our national conversation centers around mass shootings and solutions to them. We also need to be talking about day-to-day violence in our communities, particularly in communities of color, and looking at not only law enforcement strategies, but also community-based strategies for addressing that violence. And so there are a number of cities, including Oakland, Los Angeles, New York, New Haven, many examples from across the country of cities large and small that have been effectively addressing violence over the last few years and have a number of sort of core components in common. And I think Oakland is a great example to be looking at from St. Louis. Every city is obviously different, but Oakland is a city of about 400,000 people, so size is slightly larger, but a lot of similar issues with very high levels of violence for a number of years, a problem that seemed intractable for a long time. So I just want to hit on some of the high points of what Oakland has done over the last few years and potentially some solutions and tools that could be brought and implemented in St. Louis. And hopefully we'll explore these later on as we get further the conversation. One of the first things a few years ago that Oakland did was, as a city, take a very serious and intentional look at the data behind violence to really understand what were the dynamics that were driving violence. For many years, the assumption by community members and by law enforcement was that violence was being driven by this sort of disparate group of young people, that the majority of shootings were involving young people who were having disputes over drugs. And it turns out, after looking at the data, the average age of a perpetrator and victim of gun violence in Oakland was actually much closer to 30 years old. And so for a long time on the community side, the solution to violence was we need to invest more in youth programs. And that was sort of the focus of the community response. And obviously there's nothing wrong with youth programs, and that is absolutely, we should be investing in prevention, and we would expect that to pay off down the line. But if you're trying to reduce violence here and now in the next 1 to 2 or 3 years, and the average age of a perpetrator or victim is 30, investing in youth programs as your primary strategy obviously won't bring about the results that you need quickly. And so when the city did this work and it brought in an outside technical assistance provider to help analyze data and understand what's actually driving violence, then both the law enforcement agencies in Oakland and Oakland Police Department and community groups both really changed and refocused their strategy to focus on this small number of individuals that were driving the majority of violence, and also focusing on that slightly older population. And that's actually one of the most interesting takeaways from Oakland, and we see this in many, many cities across the country, is that it's a very small percentage of individuals driving the vast majority of violence. And there's really important policy consequences for that, including the fact that police tactics that involve mass arrests or trying to judge or success or failure by how many people you're arresting is probably not the best way to go about reducing violence. There's actually a very small targeted group that should be focused on, both in terms of positive interventions, mentoring and social services, and also law enforcement where there's actually been an incident of violence. And so I'll just briefly outline a few of the other things Oakland has done to follow this data and follow this evidence. The first is a very robust and sustained investment in targeted intervention programs for those at highest risk of violence. And so the city actually passed a ballot initiative back in 2014 that invests 50% essentially go into law enforcement strategies and 50% to community-based strategies for addressing violence. And that money, which generates $20 million a year for 10 years, so we're talking about $200 million over a decade, is significant in size, and then also focused, like I said, on addressing serious violence. And it has allowed Oakland to build up the city-based infrastructure where we actually have an agency called Oakland Unite that helps to organize community-based organizations that focus on addressing violence in Oakland. And so that whole system also coordinates with law enforcement. And on the law enforcement side, Oakland has decided to focus very exclusively on addressing serious violence. An entire department was created within OPD to focus on solving and addressing violent crime, and also building back lost trust between police and community. And so this is the last point I'll make, is that there's a major focus on repairing this damaged relationship between police and community. And that is a thread that you see that's very common in cities across the country. That in areas of high violence, and I know St. Louis is the same on this, there are strained relationships between police and community that have to be addressed if we're going to see progress on this issue. And in Oakland, and I'm sure this is true in St. Louis, there was a very low solve rate for homicides. So a large number of homicides were going unsolved, and that perpetuated the cycle of retaliation and violence that we were seeing. And interrupting that cycle and gaining back the trust of community is really important in terms of addressing violence. So there's not one sort of magic solution, but I will say by putting in place that sustained investment, focusing on a number of police reforms, and then combining that with a very community-centric approach that aim to give interventions and social services to people at the highest risk of being involved with violence, that really helped move the needle in Oakland and in other communities around the country. And I think for St. Louis to focus on those two areas and to have that, this is the very last thing I'll say, to have that focus in the city, the highest levels of government in Oakland got behind these strategies, from the mayor to the police chief, and the demand for those changes came from the community. People were rallying for many years to have their city council members and the mayor embrace these strategies. So a lot of this needs to live with the community and come from the ground up. But when all those factors sort of get in line on a common agenda, you can see a lot of change in a very short period of time. And hopefully that is what ends up happening in St. Louis. And at Giffords, we're happy to help provide information and to bring that change that is so badly needed. So thank you. And I'm excited to be here.
Rick, I think Dr. Rosenfeld, I think you're still muted here.
How's that?
That's better.
Good. Let me introduce Thomas Apt. Thomas teaches, studies, and writes about the use of evidence-informed approaches to reduce urban violence. He's the author of the book, Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. He is a senior fellow with the Council on Criminal Justice in Washington. Prior to the council, he served as senior fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School and Law School. Before that, he held leadership positions in the New York Governor's Office and the U.S. Department of Justice. His work has been featured in major media outlets, including, I won't read the whole list here, Thomas, but The New Yorker, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and others. Thomas, you're up.
Sure. So like Rick, like many people who are on this call and many of the people who are listening to this Zoom, this issue is both professional and personal for me. I've been working on this issue in one respect or another for more than 20 years. When I was a young man working as a high school teacher in inner city Washington, D.C., one of my favorite students was murdered. And so I've seen this work as a prosecutor, as a political appointee, as an academic. So from all those angles, the most important takeaway to know, and I think this is true that from everybody on this call and from the people who've studied this and worked on this issue for a long time, is urban violence is not inevitable. It doesn't have to be this way. If you put the right combination of solutions together, you can see urban violence fall quickly. What happened in Oakland can happen to you. And I just want to second everything that Mike said. And if there's anything that sounds similar, I think it's important for you to understand the reason that there's repetition is because there's agreement on what works and what doesn't in terms of urban violence reduction. And there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. And so you really need to understand that there's an expertise out there, and that if you use this expertise and gain this expertise, you too can have success. A few years ago, a colleague of mine from Harvard and an army of grad students, we took on the task of synthesizing all of the most rigorous evidence concerning urban violence reduction. And what we found, synthesizing, summarizing the results of over 1,400 individual impact evaluations was somewhat surprising. What we learned is that there were some key themes of the most successful strategies, some sort of secret ingredients that made them most effective. And there were really three of them. The first one was focus. The most successful anti-violence programs, whether they're enforcement, intervention, or prevention, are extremely focused. They focus on the small numbers of people and places that disproportionately cause urban violence. Urban violence, even in the most dangerous neighborhoods, is not spread out evenly. It's highly concentrated, and so you need similarly concentrated strategies in order to be successful. Second, the strategies that we saw collectively were balanced, meaning we saw some very, quote unquote, tough on crime, police, law enforcement strategies that were effective at reducing gun violence. But we also saw some very community-based, very prevention-oriented strategies that were also effective at reducing urban violence. And in fact, when you look around the nation, there is no city that's had success over the long run that has either arrested their way out of violence or programmed their way out of violence. It has to be both. And that's something that people have to understand and accept. If you politically are so opposed to the police that you believe that the police have no role in this issue, and that you view them with such suspicion and such hostility that you can't come and sit at the same table with them, then you will not be successful in reducing urban violence. On the other hand, if you believe that the only solution to urban violence is to arrest more people and get tougher and tougher and lock them up, and that you need to stop and frisk large numbers of people, you too will fail. That message of balance is something that's hard to hear from people, but it's very important. And then finally, I would just second what Mike said, and that we saw that that third element is something we called fairness or legitimacy. The most successful strategies have the support of the communities that they're working in, and that's very important. And so if you are going to do this work, you must be focused, balanced, and fair. So let me just ask this. If the answer is out there, and if we've had success in the past, why can't cities, first of all, sustain this success? And why can't that success spread from city to city? Why haven't we done better if the answers are so obvious or so available? Well, I think there's two answers to that. The first, unfortunately, is politics. These strategies that I'm talking about don't really line up with the political talking points of either the hard left or the hard right. And so they don't really play to the political base of one type of politician or another. And so it can be hard to persuade people to change their minds and change their attitude and change their politics in order to adopt these strategies. The second thing is that, and I think that one of the things you have to get out of this framework of is you have to stop thinking about urban violence as an argument to be won. You have to think about urban violence as a problem to be solved. And if you think about it as a problem, you will be more open to the varying kinds of solutions that can ultimately be effective. And then I think we have to be very honest that the second reason that these strategies have not been more successful is race. And just the truth of it is that this problem disproportionately impacts poor people of color. And if it impacted another group with more political power and political influence, we would have seen more results. And so that is an unfortunate reality that we have to deal with. Can people hear me?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, very good. And so what I would suggest is that what you need are two things. First, you need the know-how. You need to have the evidence. You need to have the science. You need to bring people either locally, like Professor Rosenfeld, or from outside, like Mr. McLively. And you need to get that know-how into your city. But then the second thing is you need leadership. You need leadership from the very top, and that means the mayor, that means the police chief, and that means other key people in the city council. And they need to unite around these three principles of focus, balance, and fairness. And then you can create a coalition that's sustainable over the time. But the evidence alone won't do it. It has to take political leadership. I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Our third speaker is Daniel Isom. Dan is the retired chief of police for the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department. He was our city's 33rd chief of police when he was appointed in October of 2008. He received a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD in criminology and criminal justice from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. He also holds a master's in public administration from St. Louis University. He's a graduate of the FBI National Academy, FBI National Executive Institute, and the Police Executive Forum Senior Management Institute. He's also the 2013 Eisenhower Fellow and a 2016 University of Chicago Institute of Politics Fellow. He currently serves as an adjunct professor at UMSL and at the Washington University School of Social Work. And he is the executive director of the Regional Justice Information Service. Dan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rick. Like many of the previous speakers said, A lot of what I will say will be somewhat redundant because there isn't a lot of disagreement on how we approach this issue, both in St. Louis and nationally. But I think it's important, like the other speakers, to kind of tell a little bit of a background about where you came from and why this issue in terms of gun violence is so important to me, both on a personal level, but also on a professional level. Before entering the police profession, I was touched by gun violence very personally. I had domestic violence issues in my family related to gun violence. I had a grandfather who was the victim of gun violence with a robbery, and an uncle who was murdered as a result of gun violence. So even before joining the police department, gun violence was a very important and central issue to who I am as a person and how I delivered my service to the community. But in addition to that, when I think about over the 30 years that I've been involved in law enforcement and in the criminal justice field, as Rick has talked about, you could probably say there's been an average of 150 homicides in St. Louis over the course of 30 years. That's almost 4,500 people who have died as a result of gun violence over the course of my career. And on a professional level, that is a lot of death that you have seen and been a part of. But also, those are more than just numbers. Those are people. Those are loved ones who, like myself, have lost people as a result of gun violence. So it has always been a central issue in terms of my policing profession. The most important thing is safety in terms of loss of life and serious harm that comes from gun violence. And so, as both of our previous speakers has talked about, there is a lot of agreement on what strategies should be put forth to reduce gun violence. The most important thing is it has to be focused. It has to be focused on people, it has to be focused on places, and it has to be focused on crimes that are associated with gun violence. Not every crime is associated with gun violence, and there has to be a particular strategy in how you relate that particular crime to reducing gun violence. In addition to that, it takes strong relationships. It takes relationships within the community because our whole system, our whole foundation of our system is based on trust in the process. Whether you call the police for help, whether you're a witness, whether you're a victim or a juror in a trial, it all hinges on relationships. But it also hinges on cooperation. So outside agencies, whether it's other law enforcement agencies or social service agencies or any type of community agencies, need to be engaged to have a very multi-disciplined approach to how you address crime. And so the last part that I've seen is that you do need a strategy, but it needs to be flexible and dynamic, that you have to have the ability to pivot and change at a moment's notice so that you are focused on what's happening today in terms of violent crime. Over the past 7 years that I've been retired from the police department, I've had a lot of time to think about how do we really change the structure of policing? What is a new sort of philosophy that we could have that would be more in line with this more focused, evidence-based approach? And so I've really thought about a new type of concept for policing. Working with many students at UMSL and Washington University, we've coined this phrase called the therapeutic model of policing. And the therapeutic model of policing is more in line with what many people and researchers are saying today, is more in line with a medical view of policing. How can we police in a way that is more in line with curing the problem as opposed to maybe making it worse? And so I'll just read what we've come up with in terms of this concept of a therapeutic model of policing. The therapeutic model of policing, TMP, an evidence-based, multidisciplinary, social service, trauma-informed model can be used to redefine the success in policing by changing the culture both structurally and individually. Community engagement and empowerment are the backbone of this model, and it is focused on how police departments can ensure that encounters perpetuate respect for human rights of all people, regardless of whether they're a suspect or whether they have committed a crime. And so it's really a different way of thinking about policing. I'll end with this. This concept really came from social workers, and coming up through the police department, one of the things that most police department personnel and officers would say is, we're not social workers. And we're not social workers, but there are a lot of things that we could take from the social workers profession that could help us manage the very difficult things that we have to address in communities. And what I also say is that counseling, social work, psychology is not about letting people do whatever they want. It's really about helping people manage and control their behavior and their lives, and giving structure to their lives and to their communities so that they can live a more productive life. And so that's really what policing is about at its core. And so this is a new concept, and I think fundamentally, if we want to continue the trajectory of where we're going, we need to kind of figure out how we change our approach and our philosophy of how we police.
Thank you, Dan. Okay, I have just a couple of brief comments by way of summary and wrap up, and then we'll move to questions and answers. One theme that I take from the comments that we've all heard is that we have a real challenge in front of us. We have to confront both the rise in violence in St. Louis, and we have to engage in needed police reform, and we have to begin improving, repairing relationships between our police department and our communities. And we have to do these things in the midst of a virulent pandemic and a major economic recession. So we have a real challenge in front of us. On the issue of police reform, I think one of the major themes there is we need to think very seriously, and Dan Isom touched on this, as did Thomas, very seriously about what functions the police currently perform that can be performed by other entities. The response to violence cannot exclude the police, but the police cannot be or have the sole responsibility for responding. There is the need for social service agencies, public health, and community groups to play important roles in this effort. Without them, if we were to rely simply on the police, I don't think we're going to be successful. So when we talk about police reform and we want to convert protest ideals into viable policy, that's not going to be easy, but it should begin with experimentation. I think one of the problems with the implementation of otherwise promising approaches to reduce violence is that the approach is carried out all at once without careful, systematic experimentation. So in the case of reallocating certain police functions to other entities, We should select a single function and reallocate it to an agency in a limited area of the city and determine the effectiveness of that strategy. If it was effective, we expand it. If it was not effective, we recalibrate and try again. So experimenting systematically with police reform is the best way, in my view, to implement it. Now, how does all this start? You know, I share the optimism that some of our all of our speakers have as well. But it has to start with a major, in my view, public commitment on the part of our elected and our appointed leaders to address both of these goals, violence reduction and reform in policing. Both goals need to be addressed at the same time. They are intertwined goals. And with that public commitment, then the ball gets rolling to develop the coalitions that Thomas Abt described and have worked so well in other communities such as Oakland. Those are the goals of reducing violence and expanding justice for all of our citizens. And speaking for myself personally, I would like to see our elected leaders and our appointed officials make that public commitment tomorrow. Okay, with that, we are off to questions and answers. And Cara, why don't you clue us into the first question?
Thank you, Dr. Rosenfeld. We are getting so many questions through the Q&A function here of Zoom. We've got several via email. If you have any trouble with the Q&A, feel free to email at the email where your Zoom link came from. But I'll go ahead and start with a question. We've gotten several about cure violence. And today was announced that the Urban League is kicking off their Walnut Park site. We have 3 sites in the city of St. Louis. The Board of Aldermen approved over a year ago the allocation of funds for cure violence. And several folks are hoping that the panelists can weigh in on whether or not cure violence is a part of a solution. Certainly, okay. I think it is, as I voted to allocate those funds, but I'd like the panelists to weigh in.
I'll start, and then I'd like to hear from the others, anyone else who wants to contribute. I think it's part of the solution. It is certainly right now a major community-based initiative with the aim of reducing violence. It does not come cheaply. It is an expensive approach. And so we had better in St. Louis get it right. Cure violence has a track record in the research. It's not quite as long. It's not quite as promising as some other strategies, but it is indeed promising. And let's hope that as St. Louis implements its cure violence effort, it is properly evaluated, and let's all hope it's successful and we can add to that positive research record. Anyone else want to weigh in on the issue of cure violence?
Yeah, just really quickly, for anyone who's listening who might not be familiar, I just wanted to say, you know, cure violence is the name of a model that's essentially a public health approach to violence where high-risk individuals are engaged with. This is also referred to as street outreach or violence interruption, violence mediation. But the idea is to work with culturally competent street outreach workers, often people who have experience from the same neighborhood where they're working, experiences of their own, either victimization or perpetration of violence, who are trained in conflict mediation, who identify folks in neighborhoods who might be at high risk of being involved with conflict, and who then engage those folks for long periods of time. These are really like building strong relationships based on trust. And the idea is that those outreach workers have access that others might not have. And I totally agree with Rick that this is absolutely part of the solution. And again, Cure Violence is one sort of national model that we've taken a close look at and think that's had, you know, a good track record. But this idea of doing outreach, mentoring, conflict mediation with high-risk individuals, whether it's called Cure Violence or called something else. You know, Oakland also has a version of that that's very intensive. But some core component of a city's approach to violence needs to be this public health approach that is, you know, community to community, and that is identifying those at the highest risk of violence and intervening with them. I just want to lift up another solution that's in place in St. Louis and needs to be scaled up, which is hospital-based violence intervention, which is after someone has been shot, connecting them to similar resources, as opposed to what we generally do now, which is patch up someone, discharge them from the hospital right back into the circumstances that led them to be shot. And we see very high recidivism rates, and I'm sure St. Louis is no different. And so interrupting those cycles is an incredibly important part of the solution. It's just that historically, most cities have not dedicated resources to those types of solutions. And if you look at percentages of cities and what percentage of the budget goes to police departments, you see 40%, 50%. St. Louis is no different. I was looking yesterday, it was like 43%, I think. So I think in many places we have overinvested in sort of a incarceration approach, a law enforcement approach, and it's time to increase those investments in community approaches. So this step towards the $5 or $6 million that the city allocated towards Cure Violence, definitely a step in the right direction. And Rick makes a great point that just allocating the money is step one, but making sure the implementation is done well is incredibly important, and everyone in the community has a responsibility to make sure that that happens.
Thomas, I know you talk about Cure Violence in your book and Bleeding Out as part of a solution. Can you talk about how it fits in with some other things that we may consider, maybe should consider doing?
Sure. So I do believe that we've underinvested in community-based alternatives such as Cure Violence and street outreach. But I don't agree that we've overinvested in law enforcement. It may not be the right moment to say this, but I have to say that we have systematically underinvested in all of government, and from law enforcement to public health to education, and as we specifically underinvest when it comes to the poorest, least politically powerful people. And so if you look at police departments in Baltimore, in St. Louis, in Detroit, the police departments with the hardest jobs, they are often struggling to have sufficient manpower, sufficient resources, the access to the best data. So everybody has it tough in terms of funding. That doesn't mean that we don't need to emphasize the community-based side more, but that doesn't necessarily, I don't believe that should happen at the expense of law enforcement. If we need more money on this problem, raise the taxes, find the money somewhere else, because there needs to be more attention on this, not just moving the money around. That's my personal view.
Right.
In terms of Cure Violence specifically, I want to point out what Mike said, that Cure Violence is a program that is a part of a broader strategy called street outreach, but it's one vendor. And I think that Cure Violence has been extended, has been evaluated extensively. And I agree that the evidence in summary basically says promising, not yet proven, but still quite promising. But I think there's a right way and a wrong way to go about street outreach. And I think that, in fact, the best model for the way to organize street outreach is in Los Angeles. And what they did in Los Angeles is they created a street outreach community with multiple vendors, none of which had a monopoly on the street outreach work, which is very important. And then they were all trained at a central academy that was run by the city. And the city then made sure that they were all receiving the same training and an extensive training. And then they could go out and be certified to do the work. The other thing that the city did, the mayor's office did, is they made it crystal clear through those training programs that these programs, while they were independent of each other, street outreach and policing, they had to coordinate with each other. They couldn't be competing with each other. And I think one of the temptations with programs that are street outreach oriented is to say, oh, we can just give this to these community-based programs and they will handle this. That's not the way it's worked. It's never been successful that way. I doubt it will ever be successful that way. At the end of the day, you need these programs to work with the police and coordinate, even if they are operating independently. So there's a right way and a wrong way to do this. And I think it's important that St. Louis does it the right way.
Yeah, Cara, I would just add, and before Thomas mentioned LA, that's the police department that I was going to suggest would be the greatest model. But he's right, they have to work in coordination with the police department. They can be independent, but going back to our first comments, it has to be focused. And in most cases, the police department is more aware of the people who are engaged in violent crime than anyone else in the community on a holistic basis, right? They have a big picture of what's going on and individuals who may be involved. And so even though they're independent, they need that connection to the police department so they could remain focused, because a scattered shot approach is not going to work.
This is an interesting question. Can a city like St. Louis attempt to reform criminal justice and reduce violent crime at the same time? And how can these two ideas intersect?
Just very briefly, not only can they be done at the same time, my view is they have to be done at the same time. I don't think pursuing one avenue to the exclusion of the other is going to get us where we want to be. If we don't improve relationships between the police department and communities that they serve, then, as Dan Isom was saying, we won't get the kind of cooperation and support from the community that the police need to do an effective job at reducing crime. So these two approaches, they are separate conceptually, but in practice, they have to work together. So the answer is yes, they can both be done at the same time, and they should both be done at the same time.
I would just second everything that Rick said. I think it's absolutely essential that we do both of these at the same time. And I want to make a point, which is that police violence and community violence are very much linked to one another. If there is more police violence, you will see more community violence, because that police violence will deeply discourage impacted communities, and it will increase violence among the community members themselves, because they won't use the police and they won't trust the police. And so it's very important to understand that you can do these programs, but unless you are also strengthening and reforming the institutions around which these programs are operating, ultimately you can't have sustainable success. So I really think it's very important to not frame gun violence, addressing gun violence and addressing criminal justice reform as an either or. I think it's much more important to frame it as a both and.
Yes.
Along the same lines, questions about racism within the police department itself. We recently had a very unfortunate, tragic incident in which a Black undercover police officer was greatly injured by fellow officers who did not recognize him. And so the question is really, how can we talk about that issue specifically in St. Louis?
I'll jump in and just say, that's an incredibly important piece of all this is dealing with structural racism. Part of what Oakland did, I think is interesting and worth pointing out, is that at the demand of the community, implemented a department-wide implicit bias training program that's involved community members partnering with police officers to come and train every single officer in OPD on not just implicit bias, but also the history of policing in Oakland, a long and strained, history between police and community to help officers understand, maybe you as an individual don't have racist thoughts and you're a great person, but you have to understand the context you're stepping into and the way the community views the department based on decades of, at times, abusive and racist behavior. So I think that type of training is incredibly important and part of the solution here. And I think it was unique that OPD allowed community members to come in and help lead that effort. And then obviously what we were talking about earlier, the shift from a sort of warrior mentality for our police to a guardian mentality, and everything that comes along with that, focusing on de-escalation, more foot patrols to build up, relationships with community. A lot of those different tactics will speak to police community relations. And the last thing I'll say is having city leadership that's actually measuring those things, asking citizens, do you trust the police? And at the end of your term as mayor, if that's improved, great. And leadership in a city needs to be measuring those metrics, not just how many homicides occurred, but is trust improving? Are we reducing arrests while improving public safety? And if city leaders aren't measuring that and paying attention to it closely, it's not going to change.
It's such an important
Right.
point. We collect data. Go ahead, Dr. Isom.
Yeah, I think that's very important. I mean, taking the pulse of the police department, both internally and then the community externally, is very important to figuring out where you stand right now and then what progress you've made. But dealing with structural racism, it has to be intentional, a plan with ongoing conversations and really looking at the structure of your organization to see if it actually is in line with trying to break down barriers between groups and between the community. So it really takes really an intentional process that is measured over time, and it's continuous work. And you have to look throughout the organization from your hiring process to your termination process, because both of those can have an impact on both internally in terms of relationships, but externally as well.
Yeah, and the process of moving people up within the police department. This has certainly been an issue recently in both St. Louis City and St. Louis County. Thinking about crime in urban areas as a health issue brings up a health issue that we have talked about significantly lately, and that is lead exposure and environmental pollutants and how those play into an unhealthy environment, and one that may result in criminal activity. Would any of the panelists like to weigh in on how we can start to address that as part of a crime as part of this, an overall crime plan?
I'll say only that researchers at St. Louis University have now conducted several studies showing a connection between areas of the city in which children test very high for the presence of lead in their systems and crime rates in those areas. And that's even controlling for, holding constant, the socioeconomic characteristic of the area. So there is a linkage. I'm not an urban health expert. Maybe others can weigh in on this, but I don't know the best way of ensuring that our children grow up lead-free. But it clearly is an important issue.
I'll say that.
Yeah, I would just second.
Go ahead, Thomas. Yeah.
Sorry, so I think that there's some evidence suggesting, I don't think it's proven yet, a connection between exposure to lead and crime rates. But I think we should absolutely move forward with with lead remediation in these areas. There's also treatments available for children who are exposed to lead treatment that have been proven to be effective. So it's not just about that. But I just want to point out That is very important, but that is the opposite of focus. And you can expect results even if you would make a massive investment today in about 15 to 20 years.
Right.
So that is not an answer for urban violence in St. Louis today. It's still important to do, but you must remain focused on the highest risk people and places if you expect to see a reduction in shootings and killings in the city in the short and midterm.
We are so siloed in our governance in St. Louis. We have so many municipalities, many of which have their own police departments and their ways of doing things. This is a question about regionalism and whether or not we should be trying to address this and coordinating, collaborating on a regional level, and what input should be taken from those regional voices.
Well, if the watchword is focus, I don't think we have time to wait for enduring regional cooperation around this issue. There is already collaboration between the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, whose jurisdiction is the city of St. Louis, and the St. Louis County Police Department, and indeed municipal police departments in the county. It's not as if they don't ever talk to one another. It is also true that crime doesn't recognize the boundary between St. Louis City and St. Louis County. Recent research done at UMSL has shown that about a third of the people arrested in the city of St. Louis reside in St. Louis County, and a healthy percentage of those arrested for crime in St. Louis County are city residents. So crime doesn't respect the boundary. Crime is regional, but I think most of us who are participating tonight from St. Louis would agree that a formally regional approach, such as combining the two police departments, or having St. Louis County take over policing for the county, that sort of thing. We're going to wait a long, long time for those things to happen. Focus means that we have to address the crime problem in the city of St. Louis, and indeed in St. Louis County, as it accumulates on a day-to-day basis in the short run. Regional collaboration is a great idea, but it's certainly not a sufficient condition for addressing our crime problem.
I would agree with Rick, but I would also say there is a considerable amount of cooperation that goes back and forth between law enforcement agencies in the St. Louis metropolitan area. You know, St. Louis City and St. Louis County and many of the smaller municipalities are working together behind the scenes on a regular basis. The organization that I'm the executive director of, the Regional Justice Information Service, shares information regionally throughout all the police departments in the region. There's a major case squad that is activated for smaller agencies that have homicides in the area. So I think there is a considerable, it always could be better, but there is quite a bit. But what I would say is that many of these issues are local, and although they may cross over in terms of relationships, you don't find too many people in certain neighborhoods in St. Louis City, driving out to St. Charles doing shootings. Shootings and robberies are mainly local. Now, do you have some incidents that may go out into other areas and a robbery occurs? But that's not the typical way that these things happen. They're very focused and centered into particular areas and particular groups of people. And so I don't know in terms of gun violence that there is much crossover in terms of the gun violence that happens in our community. Is it some? Yes, but it is very focused in particular areas.
The term defund the police has become a household term now. And it's also become a political football. How can the basic idea of putting more resources into a balanced approach of community, healthiness, wellness, be worded or discussed in a way that isn't such a gotcha phrase? I mean, as we all know, the political consequences of this are fairly real, and we've all pointed out that in order to move forward with a comprehensive plan, there needs to be strong political support across the political spectrum.
Right. I don't think we know how much a comprehensive plan will cost. So I think defund the police, among other things, is putting the cart before the horse. If we seriously begin discussing and then implementing the reallocation of certain functions currently performed by the city police department to other agencies, we do the appropriate experimentation and expansion where appropriate. I don't know, and I don't know that anyone knows how much that's going to cost. So yes, it may be possible to reduce funding for the police if reallocation is substantial, and if the other agencies, of course, don't have their own claims on the city budget. So who knows if defunding the police is in fact a reality as opposed to simply a slogan. We have to carry out the dual functions of addressing gun violence and reforming the police. And then we can determine how much that will cost. And at that point, we can decide whether the police budget is correct, whether it needs to be lower, or indeed whether it must increase.
Well, I think this was mentioned both by Thomas and Mike in different forms, but I think defunding the police really means reallocating resources to things that are not traditionally law enforcement and criminal justice activities. I don't think it has to be an either or. I think the point that Thomas made is that we have not funded either one of them sufficiently. Mm-hmm. And really in the short term, looking at what St. Louis City is dealing with, we have a police department that needs more resources, not in terms of arresting individuals, but just to have a greater presence on the street. We have high levels of crime that need the resources to be more focused, to follow up on crimes. And that takes an extraordinary amount of resources, not just to lock people up, but to be very focused about your approach. So I would suggest we really need to look at not only what our police department is doing, but whether or not we need more resources in the short term to address high levels of violent crime, but also increasing the level of funding for those other resources, like cure violence. So I don't think it's an either or. I think both of them need more funding.
Mm.
Yeah.
We'll take just two more questions. One about our current gun laws, and this is specifically for you, Dr. Isom, about how we can move forward with addressing violence with the current Missouri state gun laws, which have preempted the city of St. Louis from really imposing any additional laws in that regard.
Well, I hate to be redundant, but I mean, it goes back to focus. You can only control what you can control, right? And there are a number of gun laws on the books right now that are focused on the individuals that we're talking about. We are capable of using those gun laws to be focused on those individuals. Now, is it more difficult based on the laws that we have here in Missouri? That's absolutely true. I think it was 2006 that the legislature changed the law that allowed anyone 21 or older to carry a gun in their car without a permit. We changed the permit to purchase law in Missouri. And then we've always had the ability for individuals who didn't have a felony to carry a weapon open. We've always had an open carry law in Missouri for years, even before the changes in concealed carry without a permit. And so we have always had very open laws in Missouri. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to change anytime in the future. So what we have to be is very focused on those individuals in those places and those crimes. And we do have the gun laws that can address those individuals. Now, it's not easy, but it will take what we've been talking about in terms of focus, community, and strategy to do that.
And lastly, we've had so many folks tuning in tonight. It's really been a remarkable participation here. The last question that I'll ask here is about community involvement. To what extent have community members been given legitimate power in the solutions with government entities in other cities, Oakland, LA, some of the other entities that were mentioned here tonight? What can members of the public do to get involved?
I'll jump in on this one and just say it's incredibly important to have community involvement. I mean, one of the places people can start, I think people always ask, what can I do? Find out what organizations are in St. Louis that are doing violence prevention work. One that I'm familiar with is Better Family Life, that's doing mediations and have a 24-hour hotline people can call if they're worried about violent conflict. Find out how you can support those organizations. The Violence Prevention Commission that Jessica sent the link to those who are participating. There are community, activities happening in St. Louis to address violence. So do some research, find out what's going on. If you can't donate your time, all of these efforts require resources to function. So for those of you who are here from a corporation or foundation, like to the last question, we obviously Missouri needs to improve its gun laws, and that will help save lives. But in the meantime, the strategies we're talking about today of police reform and improving community infrastructure, that can happen today. And so I would say, do your research, find out what's going on. And the last thing is organize. Community organizing is incredibly powerful. And we saw that firsthand in Oakland, where community really demanded that the city pay attention and start implementing these solutions. And that would be my number one recommendation, is start to get organized and take your demands to your city leaders.
Thomas, did you want to mention, can you speak a little bit about some of the specific ways the government has organized community involvement in other cities?
Sure. I just want to point out something that's maybe, I don't want to be end on a negative note, but I do want to note that just because something is community-based doesn't mean it works. And just as there are effective policing strategies and ineffective policing strategies, there are effective community-based strategies and there are ineffective community-based strategies. And you have to get educated about what works and what doesn't. And in cities where there is a robust community-based structure, pretty soon people know who's doing the real work and who isn't. And it's important that the right people get funded. It's not enough just to be from the community. You still have to have the right theory of change, the right strategy, and the right approach, and the right level of commitment. And so we, by all means, need more community involvement. But we also need, but that doesn't mean that we lose sight of effectiveness.
I'll give a couple shouts out. Jessica Myers of the St. Louis Area Violence Prevention Commission has been tuning in tonight, and she did post the website of that organization, which has a lot of participation here regionally. We mentioned the Urban League and Employment Connection, which is running those first 3 cure violence sites here in St. Louis. They're all accepting applications for folks to be involved officially, and certainly taking volunteers. And in closing, I want to give you all each an opportunity to say a few closing words before we close out. We've had such great participation here tonight. We can start maybe with you, Mr. Thomas Abt, if you don't mind. If you had any closing remarks.
Sure. I would just say that, you know, I think that the challenge of bringing people together around these three principles of focus, balance, and fairness is perhaps never been harder, because we have so many political forces trying to pull us apart, setting us against one another, but it's never been more urgent. Rick and I did recent research less than a month ago, and based on that research, we are very concerned about rates of gun violence this summer and throughout the year, both in St. Louis and nationally. And so it has never been more urgent to try to put the ideologies aside and really look at this extremely important problem as just that, a problem.
Mike, did you have any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just say I think it's right what we're talking about here, where we shouldn't be setting up this sort of false dynamic of like taking from the police to give the community, or taking from police to give from community to give the police. That's not the option that's in front of us. And I think you know, a lot of this is about resources and investing resources, and you quickly get pushback from people saying, well, this is going to cost too much. I think it's really important when we're having that conversation to point out the incredibly high cost of gun violence. We didn't spend a lot of time tonight talking about that, but there's tons of great research out there about the astronomical cost of gun violence, and between law enforcement costs, healthcare costs, lost wages. There's all these different things, and any given state, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars every single year. And that's in addition to obviously just the immeasurable human costs. So, you know, when we're going to have these arguments about resources, we have to also say, well, how much is this problem costing us, and how much could we actually be saving by investing in evidence-based and effective solutions?
Dr. Isom?
Well, I'd just like to say, I know we've got, you know, very difficult challenges. We've got a pandemic we're dealing with, social unrest, an economic crisis, in addition to higher levels of gun violence in the city of St. Louis. But I think what's most important is that, as we talked about, this is not inevitable. It's not something that you can't address. It is something that you can reduce. And so I just want people to be hopeful that there are solutions out there, and that we don't have to continue to have gun violence, even though it may be very difficult. It's about us coming together, putting together a plan, fostering strong relationships, and we can have an impact. I hear so many people in St. Louis say, there's nothing you can do about a person getting killed. Well, there is. There are strategies that you can reduce that. You may not reduce them all. You're not going to solve them all, but you can reduce them to a level that is more acceptable. And so just a message of hope that there is hope that we can reduce the number of violent crimes that happen in the city of St. Louis and in our region.
Dr. Rosenfeld, will you close us up?
Yes. You know, not too long ago, in 2003, the city of St. Louis, by the end of that year, had fewer than 100 homicides. Now, that's 100 or fewer too many. So to Dan Isom's point, that we can do better. Indeed, we have done better not too long ago. So these proposals that you've heard about tonight are realistic proposals. I don't think we're going to get very far, and I'll just repeat what I said a bit earlier. I don't think we'll get very far, however, in getting this ball rolling if we don't hear from our elected and appointed city leaders that they too are committed to bringing all available resources to bear on addressing gun violence and improving relationships with the communities in the police and making needed reforms to policing policy and practice. We need that public commitment from our elected leaders to get this ball rolling. Otherwise, forums like this one will simply repeat ad nauseum as violence continues to increase and as we lose our way with respect to reforming policing. I'd like to hear that public commitment in short order.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenfeld. I will point out several members of the Board of Aldermen joined us here tonight. We're watching along. I think that while that doesn't, as I point out on the front end, indicate support, I think we are seeing a shift in our political environment here, and I'm hopeful that I know I'm not alone in supporting these and committing to this work. And I'll just close us out by saying thank you all for joining us. You all are idols of mine in many ways. Admire all the work that you're doing. I'd like to give it, we've talked about some of the work that you've done. If you haven't received a copy from me yet of Bleeding Out, go buy one. It's an excellent book. I've read it twice now. Mike McLively's work, A Case Study in Hope, is actually free for download. And we'll follow up and make sure you have access to these great works, phenomenal, very inspiring, hopeful paths through violence, and of course continue to follow and be appreciative of the work of both Dr. Isom and Dr. Rosenfeld here locally and the work you're doing to bring programs like this and plans like this back to St. Louis. I have more hope now than I've had in a long time for the future of our community. Things can look bleak. In fact, they often do, dealing with systemic racism, COVID, and this, what seems to be relentless gun violence. But it's always the moments of darkest, our greatest darkness, that we see the greatest light. And I'm seeing that here tonight by the amount of people that have participated and being able to share some time with you all. With that, I just thank you all again for participating, and we'll make sure that everybody has information on how to follow up with each of you as we move forward.